Hi, I am Diana Lang, and during this presentation, I will discuss Malcolm Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point, an exploration of what makes cultural phenomenons happen. Gladwell moves through time, among cultures, and between types in order to demonstrate that these cultural phenomenons can be explained by examining only a handful of elements. In the end, Gladwell seems to be communicating that the means of transmission is more important than what is being transmitted, and that understanding the nature of how behavior is altered is more important than the kind of behavior that is being altered. Utilizing the techniques that Gladwell outlines, he demonstrates how we can make powerful positive change in our world, but also illustrates the tragedy that can occur when the principles of tipping points are ignored. The Tipping Point is a national bestseller by Malcolm Gladwell, a best-selling author whose work consistently approaches ordinary social situations, events, or phenomenon and explain them in unconventional ways. In this book, Gladwell attempts to explain how trends and fads become full-blown cultural events. In doing so, Gladwell intentionally utilizes the language of the medical field, often calling these events epidemics and referring their spread as infections. There isn't a negative implication to this, however. Instead, the language simply underscores Gladwell's basic understanding of these events as functioning in ways that are similar to diseases, for better or worse, and in ways that we poorly understand. Gladwell has organized his thesis into three primary rules, each of which gives way to significantly more breadth and nuance than a rule typically has. These three rules also govern the format of the book, as Gladwell walks the reader through each rule before eventually trying to put it all together and guiding toward the application of these concepts in the context of smoking among American teenagers. In The Tipping Point, Gladwell argues that all social epidemics require the involvement of key individuals. These individuals are the connectors, the mavens, and the salesmen. Not all epidemics require all three types of individuals, and some involve a variety of each. Truly large-scale epidemics probably require whole groups of these individuals, Gladwell argues, but no epidemic arises without them. We'll start with the connectors. Connectors are generally able to manage more relationships than the average person. These relationships may not be deeper than ordinary individuals, but they are significantly broader. Gladwell argues that these individuals simply care about their acquaintance relationships more than the average person. This breadth allows connectors to travel between worlds and to transmit interests between them. The connector is essential to the creation of epidemics because otherwise fads and interests burn out within a class or group of people. Next is the maven. The maven is a knowledge expert that helps create epidemics because people trust them implicitly. These are the individuals that keep businesses honest by monitoring sales and by actively comparing things like price and value. The maven is not an expert in the traditional sense. They don't need to be an engineer or engaged in the field. Instead, they seek information keenly and share it freely. Often, a maven is turned to for a variety of concerns, ranging from what television set an individual should buy to which cars they should shop for. The salesman is a natural communicator that excels at connecting with individuals and convincing them of the value regarding whatever they're promoting. This persuasiveness is hard to understand. Gladwell points out that two individuals can use the same sales script and deliver the message in much the same manner. However, a natural salesman will experience a higher success rate. This is because the salesman is able to connect with us on a personal level effortlessly. Part of this effect Gladwell seems to attribute to their earnest sincerity. For the rest, Gladwell effectively demonstrates that we understand persuasiveness rather poorly. While we are inclined to believe that we are persuaded by logic and reason, or at least passion and fear, Gladwell points out that studies have demonstrated this may not be as true as we would like. Instead, we may be affected by poorly understood micro-communications such as physical synchronization and tonal inflection. The stickiness factor is the second rule of epidemics. Essentially, this rule relates to how well a message stays with the transmittee once it's been delivered. As Gladwell points out, a message, no matter how compelling, is ineffective if it fails to catch the imagination of the recipient. Although the chapter focuses largely on how we communicate messages to children, and how poorly we've really understood that communication in the past, the subtext seems to be that we, at times, equally fail to examine how we're communicating to our own peer group and the world at large. As Gladwell points out, there is a way to package any message for any group of people, but failure to consider this factor and to account for it effectively inevitably means that our message fails too. The final rule is the power of context. In order to begin exploring the power of context, Gladwell illustrates the broken window theory of crime. He starts with the story of Goetz, a middle-aged man who was confronted by 4 African-American youths on a New York City subway. The 4 approached him in a threatening manner and demanded that he hand over $5. While we might excuse Goetz for attempting to defend himself or his property, his reaction was savagely out of proportion with the threat. Goetz immediately drew a weapon and began firing on the young men. He even stopped over the body of one of the victims, commented on the fact that he looked fine, and proceeded to shoot 2 more bullets into him. Even after he turned himself in, Goetz couldn't explain the phenomenon or why he reacted so brutally. Gladwell utilized the broken window theory to explain it. Goetz lived in a neighborhood devastated by poverty, ridden with panhandlers and crime, and rode subways covered in graffiti where savage crimes like murder and robbery were not uncommon. Under the broken window theory, Goetz was reacting, at least in part, to the circumstances of his environment. On the large scale, this seems to have turned out to be true. Gladwell outlines the efforts of Bill Bratton, a believer in the broken window theory, who was placed in charge of policing New York's public transportation. His first move was to target individuals who failed to pay their fares. Then they moved on to reclaiming the subway cars themselves. This effort led to a dramatic reduction in crime on the subways, and when the techniques were brought to the city at large, eventually had the same effect on New York City crime generally. The second lesson on context involved developing an understanding of an individual's social channel limits. According to Gladwell, this social channel, by and large, defines our sense of community and is limited to roughly 150 people. While we may care about and have empathy for others beyond that circle, their concerns become excessively attenuated to ours, and it's hard to maintain the same level of intensity when considering their issues. According to Gladwell, the key to affecting change is understanding that it happens in communities of roughly 150 people. While connectors may give way to overlap, we can't lose sight of the basic fact that for all the cities have grown, our sense of community and self have not. Gladwell has provided an interesting and nuanced view of human behavior and social epidemics that provide new insight into how trends emerge. The Tipping Point has provided useful insight into our everyday lives. How can we better leverage our mavens? How can we better communicate to one another? And how do we define our own sense of community and our place in it? That concludes my presentation on Gladwell's book, The Tipping Point. I appreciate you taking the time to listen.